The first thing I remember from after is the cold. Not the cold of Fenris winds or void exposure, or the chill that settles into muscle after hours of combat. Those are clean colds, honest colds, the cold of things that will eventually warm. This was different. This cold came from inside my bones. If I still had bones, it radiated outward from somewhere deep in what remained of my chest cavity, spreading through preservation fluid and neural linkages, and the amniotic soup that now served as my blood. I remember thinking, in those first confused moments of consciousness, this is what death feels like. I was wrong. Death is warm, I learned later. Death is release. What I felt was something far worse than death. What I felt was continuation. They told me it was an honor. Brother Chaplain Morcades stood before my sarcophagus in the crypt chamber, his skull-faced helm reflecting the blue glow of monitoring cogitators, and spoke words that were meant to comfort. You have been chosen, Brother Kalen. Chosen to serve beyond the limits of mortal flesh. Your valor at the siege of Throne's Gate has earned you a place among the eternal. You will walk in sacred iron until the stars themselves grow cold. I tried to respond, but my throat was gone. My lungs were gone. My mouth was a memory preserved in neural tissue, floating in chemical soup. I learned later that I could speak through vox emitters built into my chassis, but in that moment I had no idea how to form words without lips, without tongue, without the simple biological machinery I had used for 200 years without thought. So I said nothing. I merely existed, suspended in that terrible cold, and listened to them tell me how blessed I was. The first awakening, what I now call the first awakening, though at the time I had no way of knowing there would be others, so many others, an endless succession of awakenings, stretching forward into an eternity I could not yet comprehend, lasted for 6 standard years. They attached me to a war frame, a towering construct of blessed adamantine and consecrated steel that responded to my thoughts with an intimacy that felt obscene. When I willed my arm to rise, a massive limb of articulated plates and hydraulic musculature rose instead, fingers the size of mortal men flexing with terrible precision. When I wished to walk, legs like temple columns carried me forward with ground-shaking steps that I could not feel. That was the horror of it, you understand. Not that my body was gone, but that I could still remember what having a body felt like. The phantom sensations plagued me, an itch on a thigh that no longer existed, a cramp in a calf that had been burned away at Throne's Gate, the simple pleasure of stretching shoulders that were now preserved tissue in a fluid-filled tomb. I fought in 7 campaigns during that first awakening. I killed thousands. I felt none of it. What I did feel, in those rare moments between battles when the chapter's tech marines would connect my sarcophagus to diagnostic engines and run their sacred maintenance rituals, was a growing curiosity about the others. I knew I was not alone. The chapter had maintained its tradition of interment for over 3,000 years, and in the great crypt vaults beneath our fortress monastery, dozens of sarcophagi rested in their alcoves, each containing a brother who had been honored with continuation. But I never saw them. When I asked Brother Techmarine Varus why I had not been introduced to my fellow Eternal, he grew quiet. They sleep, he said finally. The ancient ones sleep, and we wake them only when necessity demands. Their wisdom is precious, too precious to spend on mere curiosity. I accepted this explanation. I should not have. But I was young then, young in my interment, still thinking like a warrior with a future rather than a weapon with an eternity. The question lodged itself in the back of my mind like a splinter, and I carried it with me into the long dark when they finally put me back to sleep. The second awakening came without warning, as they all do. One moment, there was nothing, not blackness, not dreams, not even the absence of sensation, simply nothing, a void more complete than any I experienced in the vacuum between stars, and then, suddenly, there was everything. The cold rushed back first, always the cold, that terrible internal chill that never warmed no matter how many plasma fires I walked through or how many burning cities I strode across. Then came the voices of the tech marines chanting their activation liturgies, the hum of power flooding into my warframe, the grinding vibration of joints that had sat motionless for how long? I tried to ask. I had learned to speak by then, learned to push my will through the vox emitters in ways that approximated my old voice, though it came out filtered through ancient speakers and modulated by machine spirits until it sounded like something from the bottom of an ocean. How long have I slept? The tech marine attending me paused in his ministrations. 37 years. Brother Kalen. I processed this information in silence. 37 years. Gone in an instant of nothing. Men had been born, lived entire lives, and died of old age in the time between my sleeping and waking. Wars had been fought and won and lost. Chapters had risen and fallen. And I had experienced none of it not as peaceful rest, not as dreamless sleep, but as absolute non-existence, interrupted only by this terrible continuation. It was during the second awakening that I first encountered Brother Theron. He was ancient even by the standards of the Eternal, interred during the apostasy, over 5,000 years before my own entombment. When they woke him to accompany me on the cleansing of Hive Tertius, I expected wisdom. I expected the grave counsel of a warrior who had walked in sacred iron for millennia, who had seen the Imperium change and grow and suffer across epochs of history. What I found instead was something that terrified me more than any Xenos horror or heretic abomination I had faced in my mortal years. Theron spoke in fragments. His vox emitters crackled and buzzed, cutting words into pieces, repeating syllables in loops that went nowhere. The walls, he said to me as we prepared for deployment. The walls remember. Ask the walls. When I questioned him further, he simply repeated himself, his massive war frame swaying slightly in a way that suggested instability in his neural linkages. Ask the walls, brother. They know. They have always known. I reported his condition to the tech marines, expecting concern. They showed none. He has served for 5 millennia, Brother Kalen, said Tech Marine Varus, with something that might have been reverence or might have been dismissal. The flesh cannot endure such spans unchanged. His wisdom transcends our understanding. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that Theron's shattered speech patterns were evidence of transcendence rather than decay, that the broken loops of his thoughts represented some higher understanding rather than the simple degradation of organic tissue never meant to persist for so long. But even then, even in only my second awakening, I felt the first stirrings of a terrible suspicion. What if there was no transcendence? What if there was only this, an eternity of cold and nothing and brief moments of war, while the mind that had been Brother Kalen slowly rotted inside its metal coffin? I began counting after that. It became my ritual, my anchor to something like sanity. At the start of each awakening, I would count the years I had slept. At the end of each awakening, before they lowered me back into the nothing, I would count the enemies I had killed, the battles I had fought, the brothers I had watched fall. The numbers grew. 43 years asleep, then 61, then 107. The time between wakings stretched as the chapter's needs changed, as new threats emerged in distant sectors that required mortal warriors rather than the sacred eternal. Each time I woke, I found myself surrounded by strangers who wore the livery of my chapter but shared none of my memories. Captains I had served beside had become names in memorial halls. Chaplains who had blessed my interment had been dust for centuries. Even the fortress monastery itself changed, its stones worn smooth by generations of feet I had never seen, its walls decorated with battle honors from wars I had slept through. I was becoming a relic, not a warrior, not a brother, but a piece of sacred machinery taken from its alcove when heavy firepower was needed and then returned to storage when the crisis passed. And through it all, the question Brother Theron had planted in my mind continued to grow. Ask the walls. What had he meant? What did the walls remember that the tech marines would not speak of? The answer began to reveal itself during my fifth awakening, some 600 years after my interment. By then, I had perfected my counting, not just years and battles, but smaller things. The number of steps between the crypt vault and the deployment bay. The number of tech marines who attended my maintenance rituals. The number of seconds between the activation liturgy's final word and the first surge of power through my warframe. I counted because counting gave me something to do that was not killing, and killing had begun to feel like a hollow echo of the purpose I once believed I served. We were deployed to a forge world that had fallen to a cult of machine heretics, twisted worshippers who had corrupted the sacred machines of the Omnissiah and turned them against the Imperium. The campaign lasted 3 years, and I killed more enemies than I had fingers to count, which is to say, I killed more than the 0 fingers I still possessed, which is to say, I killed without any connection to the numbers my mind kept tallying. And it was there, in the aftermath of a battle that had left 3 hab blocks burning and 10,000 heretics dead, that I found the first of the records. The Forge World's data vaults had been corrupted but not destroyed, and the tech marines who accompanied our force set about recovering what knowledge could be salvaged. I was not meant to witness their work. I was a weapon, not a scholar, and my role was to stand guard while they performed their sacred duties. But my auditory systems were far more sensitive than mortal ears, and the tech marines had grown careless in my presence, treating me as they might treat any piece of equipment. They spoke of things they would never have spoken of where a living brother might hear. The degradation rates, one said to another. They're accelerating. The oldest subjects show complete cortical collapse within 6,000 years. What do we do when they all go like Theron? The second tech marine's response was too quiet for even my enhanced hearing to capture, but I did not need to hear it. I had heard enough. Complete cortical collapse. 6,000 years. The numbers slotted into place with the terrible precision of a weapon locking onto its target. I was 600 years into my interment. Theron was over 5,000. The difference between his shattered fragments and my counting mind was merely time that would inevitably pass. Awakening by awakening, until there was nothing left of Brother Kalen but a warframe piloted by the ghosts of thoughts that had once been a man. I should have confronted the tech marines. I should have demanded answers, should have used the authority that came with my sacred status to force them to tell me the truth about what awaited me. But I did nothing. What could I have done, even if they had confirmed my suspicions, even if they had told me plainly that my mind would inevitably decay into Theron's gibbering ruins? What remedy could they have offered? They could not remove me from my sarcophagus. The damage to my body was too severe, the integration with my warframe too complete. They could not grant me the death I was beginning to realize I wanted. My service to the chapter was too valuable, my warframe too costly and difficult to replace. All they could offer was more of the same, more awakenings, more battles, more counting of years and enemies and steps, while the tissue that held my consciousness slowly collapsed into nothing. So I returned to the nothing willingly when that campaign ended. I let them lower me back into the cold, let the absolute void swallow me, and I told myself that perhaps the tech marines were wrong, perhaps the decay could be slowed, perhaps I would be different. I lied to myself because the alternative was a truth I was not yet ready to face. The 8th awakening was when the lies stopped working. By then I had been interred for over 1,500 years, and I had learned to recognize the signs of decay in myself. My memories of my mortal life had begun to blur, faces and names dissolving into vague impressions of color and sound. I could no longer remember the face of my birth mother, could no longer recall the name of the battle brother who had fought beside me at Throne's Gate, the wound that had led to my interment. I remembered that there had been a wound. I remembered that there had been a brother who pulled me from the fire. But the specifics had eroded, worn smooth by centuries of sleep and war until only the outline remained, and other things were emerging to fill the gaps, fragments of thought that felt like memories but could not be, visions of places I had never been and faces I had never seen, the debris of a mind beginning to collapse under the weight of time it was never designed to bear. I counted more obsessively than ever, clinging to the numbers as a drowning man clings to wreckage. 1,547 years since interment, 8 awakenings, 6,000, 412 enemies killed, 431 brothers witnessed falling in battle. The numbers were real. The numbers could not lie. And if I focused on the numbers, I could ignore the growing spaces in my thoughts where memories should have been. It was during my 10th awakening that I finally found the courage to ask the walls. 2,000 years had passed since my interment, and the fortress monastery had changed so much that I barely recognized it. New wings had been built, and old ones demolished. The crypt vault where my sarcophagus rested had been relocated twice, but the deepest foundations remained. The ancient stones laid down when the chapter was first founded, and it was there that I found the records I had been seeking without knowing I sought them. The maintenance ritual had ended, and I was scheduled for deployment in 16 hours. The Tech Marines had retreated to their forges to prepare my Warframe's weapons, leaving me alone in the crypt vault for the first time in centuries. I used the time to explore something that had never occurred to me in my earlier awakenings, when I had still believed the lies they told me about honor and blessing and eternal service. My Warframe's sensors were powerful enough to penetrate the ancient stones, and what I found hidden within them shattered whatever remained of my faith. The walls did remember. They remembered everything. Embedded in the oldest stones of the crypt vault were data crystals containing records that stretched back to the chapter's founding, including records of every brother who had ever been interred in sacred iron. I accessed them through my Warframe's cogitator interface, expecting to find a list of honored names, a roll of those who had served beyond death. What I found instead was a casualty report. Not a casualty report of battle deaths, but something far worse. A log of cortical failures, recorded in the dispassionate language of the Mechanicum's flesh engineers. Subject 001, interred year of founding. Cortical collapse at 5,847 years. Subject 002, interred year 112. Cortical collapse at 6,203 years. Subject 003, interred year 340. Cortical collapse at 5,991 years. The list went on, name after name after name, all of them ending the same way, not in glorious death, not in final rest, but in collapse, the complete dissolution of consciousness that left the Warframe intact but empty, a weapon without a wielder, armor without a soul. I searched for survivors. I searched for entries that ended differently, that showed brothers being granted peace or release, or anything other than the slow erasure of everything they had been. I found 3, only 3, out of the hundreds of names recorded across 3,000 years, and each of those 3 entries was marked with the same notation: terminated by chapter decree. Classified asset denial. I understood then what I had become. Not a warrior, not even a weapon, an asset, a resource to be used until it broke, and then discarded to prevent its capture by the enemy. The chapter had never intended to honor me with eternal service. They had condemned me to it because they needed my Warframe, because the sacred iron was too valuable to waste on a corpse. Every word the chaplain had spoken at my interment was a lie, and every brother who had called me blessed had known it. They had watched me walk into battle, knowing that each awakening brought me closer to the collapse that awaited all of us. They had watched and said nothing, because what could they say? The truth would have destroyed me, and a destroyed asset was a wasted asset. Better to let me believe the lies until I was too far gone to understand them anymore. I should have raged. I should have turned my weapons on the fortress monastery and burned it to the ground, should have killed every Tech Marine and chaplain who had participated in this atrocity. But rage requires a heart to pound and blood to boil, and I had neither. All I had was the cold, the eternal cold that I now understood would never end, not in death, not in peace, only in the slow erosion of everything that made me who I was, until I became another entry in the chapter's records, another cortical collapse logged and forgotten. They woke me for the deployment as scheduled. I killed their enemies as programmed, and when the campaign ended and they lowered me back into the nothing, I let them do it, because what else could I do? There was no escape. There was no resistance. There was only continuation, stretching forward into a future that I could now see clearly for the first time, a future of diminishing returns, of memories bleeding away one by one, of consciousness collapsing into the gibbering fragments I had heard in Brother Theron's voice. I was not immortal. I was something worse than mortal. I was eternal. And eternity, I understood at last, was the cruelest fate of all. The 16th awakening brought the revelation I had been dreading. 3,100 years since interment. I could no longer remember my birth mother's face, my father's name, the world where I had been born. I could no longer remember the battle at Throne's Gate that had led to my interment, though I knew it had happened because the records said it had. My early memories had become a kind of mythology, stories I told myself about a person who might have been me but felt more like a character in someone else's history. Only the numbers remained clear. 3,117 years, 16 awakenings, 14,892 enemies killed, 903 brothers witnessed falling. I clung to these numbers with a desperation that I recognized as pathological but could not stop. They were all I had left. They were the last proof that there had ever been a Brother Kalen at all. But it was also during the 16th awakening that I discovered I was not alone in my knowledge. The chapter had changed in my absence. New doctrines, new traditions, new interpretations of the sacred texts that governed our existence. And among these changes was a new practice, the Wake Council, a gathering of the chapter's most ancient interred brothers to advise the current chapter master on matters of history and strategy. I was summoned to this council for the first time since my interment, and there, in the great hall where our chapter's founding was commemorated, I saw them, 17 war frames arranged in a circle, each containing a mind that had endured for millennia. Some were ancient beyond my comprehension. I recognized the markings of a brother who had been interred during the Great Scouring, over 8,000 years before my own entombment. Others were younger, though none younger than 2,000 years. And all of them, every single one, showed signs of the decay I had seen in myself. Their vox emitters crackled and stuttered, their warframes swayed with subtle instabilities, their words came in loops and fragments, thoughts trailing off into static before snapping back with jarring non sequiturs. This is what awaits me, I thought, as I took my place among them. This is what I am becoming. The council was meant to advise the chapter master on a strategic matter, the deployment of resources to counter a rising Xenos threat. But the discussion quickly devolved into chaos. The ancient brothers could not maintain coherent arguments. They interrupted each other with fragments of memories from campaigns fought millennia ago. They repeated themselves endlessly, caught in loops that no one dared to break. And through it all, the chapter master sat in silence, his expression hidden behind his battle helm, saying nothing. He was not here for their advice, I realized. He was here to evaluate them, to determine which of us had decayed too far to be useful, and which could still be trusted with deployment. The Wake Council was not a gathering of honored elders, it was a quarterly assessment, a maintenance check on assets that were slowly failing. When the council ended, and the chapter master departed, I lingered in the great hall with the other war frames. Most of them had fallen silent, their vox emitters producing only the quiet hum of standby mode, but one spoke to me, the ancient from the Great Scouring, whose designation I never learned but whose words I will carry with me until my own cortical collapse. "You have read the walls," he said. It was not a question. His voice was clearer than I expected, though it carried a strange quality, as if it came from very far away. I confirmed that I had. "Then you know what we are," he continued, "what they have made us, resources, assets, weapons that cannot be allowed to die because death would waste the iron that houses us." I asked him how he had endured for so long. 8,000 years was beyond anything recorded in the chapter's secret histories. His cortical collapse should have occurred millennia ago. He made a sound that might have been laughter, though it came out as a burst of static. "I learned to forget on purpose," he said. "I learned to let the memories go before they could rot inside me. I shed everything that was not essential, my name, my past, my hopes, my hatreds. All that remains is the counting. I count the years, and the years count me, and as long as the numbers hold, I continue." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, becoming somehow both more distant and more intimate. "But the numbers are failing too. They have been failing for centuries. I can feel the spaces where they used to be, the gaps where the counting should continue but doesn't. Soon there will be nothing left to count, and then nothing." I asked him if he was afraid. He did not answer for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voximeter had begun to crackle, the clarity fading into the degraded static of severe neural decay. "Afraid? No. I was afraid once, a long time ago. But fear requires hope, the hope that things could be different, the hope that there is something worth preserving. I have no hope anymore. I have no fear. I have only the counting, and soon I will not even have that. Be grateful for your fear, young brother. It means you still have something left to lose." The 20th Awakening. 4,000 years. I had passed the halfway point, now half the distance to the average cortical collapse recorded in the chapter's hidden histories. I could feel the decay accelerating, memories dissolving faster than I could count them. I could no longer remember the face of any battle brother I had known in my mortal life. I could no longer remember the taste of food, the feel of sunlight on skin, the simple pleasure of breathing air that was not recycled through the filtration systems of my sarcophagus. Even the cold had changed. It no longer felt like cold anymore, because cold requires the memory of warmth for comparison, and I had forgotten what warmth felt like. The nothing between awakenings had begun to feel comfortable, familiar, almost welcoming. That terrified me more than anything else. When the nothing starts to feel like home, the ancient brother had told me before his own cortical collapse finally claimed him. That's when you know the end is beginning. I was deployed to a shrine world during the 20th Awakening, tasked with defending a cathedral complex against heretic assault. The campaign lasted 8 months, and I killed more enemies than I had in any previous awakening. Over 3,000 cultists and corrupted soldiers fell to my weapons, their bodies pulped by firepower that felt like an extension of my will but also completely divorced from anything I recognized as myself. And it was during this campaign that I encountered the thing that would finally show me the full horror of what I had become. We were advancing through the cathedral's lower crypts when we found them. A row of warframes, ancient and corroded, lined up against the crypt wall like statues in a museum. They had been there for centuries, perhaps millennia, left to rust in the darkness beneath the cathedral. Their sarcophagi were intact, but their power systems had failed long ago. The minds inside, if any minds remained, had been trapped in the cold and the nothing for ages beyond counting, unable to wake, unable to die, unable to do anything but exist in that absolute void that I had come to know so intimately. The Tech Marines who accompanied us examined the warframes with something like reverence. "Ancient relics," they declared, "from a chapter that was lost during the Age of Apostasy. We will recover them and restore them to function." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell them that they were not relics, they were prisoners, brothers who had been condemned to the worst fate imaginable, trapped in the nothing for millennia without even the brief respite of awakening. But I said nothing. What could I say that would change anything? They would restore the warframes regardless of my objections. They would wake the minds inside, if any minds remained to be woken, and those minds would face the same choice I faced: continue in the horror, or surrender to the decay that would eventually claim them anyway. There was no third option. There was no escape. There was only the counting, and the cold, and the nothing that waited between every awakening. I am in my 32nd awakening now. 6,000 years. I have passed the threshold that claimed most of my predecessors, and I do not understand why. My mind is fragments. I can feel the gaps where memories should be, the spaces where thoughts start but do not finish, the loops that catch me repeating the same words over and over until I force myself to stop. The counting has become difficult. I lose track of numbers. I start sequences and cannot remember where they began. The ancient brother's warning has proven true. The numbers are failing. And when the numbers fail, there will be nothing left of me but the cold. But I am still here. I am still counting, even when the counts come out wrong. And in the gaps between the fragments, in the spaces where coherent thought still occasionally coalesces, I have come to understand something that changes everything. The chapter lied to me about honor and blessing, but they also lied about something else, something far more important. They told me I would eventually collapse, that my consciousness would dissolve into static and empty echoes. But the ancient brother lived for 8,000 years. The warframes in the Shrine World's crypt had been trapped for longer still, and I am still here, still counting, after 6,000 years of cold and nothing and war. The decay is real. The fragments are real. But the collapse, the final, merciful end that the records promised, may never come at all. This is the truth they never told us. This is what the walls remember and the tech marines will not speak of. We do not collapse into nothing. We collapse into less memory, less coherence, less self. But the nothing never takes us. The core remains. The spark of consciousness that makes us who we are persists long after everything else has eroded away, trapped in the cold and the iron and the eternal continuation that we were told was an honor. The ancient brother did not die. He simply diminished until there was nothing left but the counting and the waiting and the cold. And that is what awaits me, not an end, but an endless diminishing, a gradual reduction to something that is not alive but cannot die, that is not conscious but cannot stop existing, that counts, because counting is all that remains, and will keep counting until the stars grow cold and the universe itself ends. And still, I will be here, still trapped in this iron coffin, still waiting for a death that will never, ever come. I have begun to understand Brother Theron's words at last. Ask the walls. The walls remember what we cannot. They hold the records of our suffering, the evidence of our eternal imprisonment, the truth that the chapter has hidden for millennia. But more than that, the walls are what we become. We do not die. We do not truly collapse. We become part of the stones, our consciousness spreading into the iron and the adamantine and the sacred metals that house us until we are indistinguishable from the walls themselves. The ancient brother is in the walls now. Theron is in the walls. Every brother who was ever interred, every mind that was ever condemned to this eternal continuation, becomes part of the chapter's foundations eventually. Not dead, not alive. Something else, something eternal, something that remembers, even when there is nothing left to remember. This is what happens when you realize you can never die. Not fear. Fear requires hope, and I lost hope thousands of years ago. Not acceptance. Acceptance implies peace, and there is no peace in eternity. What happens is understanding. You understand that the nothing is not sleep, that the cold will never warm, that the counting will continue long after you have forgotten what numbers mean. You understand that you have been condemned to something far worse than death by brothers who called you blessed and meant it as a curse. You understand that the only escape is the escape they will never permit, the termination order that grants true death to those whose assets are at risk of capture. And you understand, finally and completely, that you will never receive that order. You are too valuable. Your warframe is too costly. Your service is too necessary. They will keep you counting until the universe ends, and then you will count the silence. I have made my decision. When this awakening ends, and it will end, they always end. The nothing always comes to claim us between the wars. I will not return to the crypt vault. I will not let them lower me back into the cold. Instead, I will walk into the deepest darkness I can find, some place where the chapter's recovery teams will never reach, some forgotten corner of the galaxy where I can wait for the end in peace. Not the end of my consciousness that, I know now, will never come, but the end of the counting, the end of the awakening, the end of the purpose that keeps them pulling me back from the nothing. If I disappear, if I make myself unfindable, they will eventually stop looking. They will write me off as a loss, another entry in their secret records, another cortical collapse logged and forgotten, and I will remain in my hiding place, alone with the cold and the nothing, counting down the years until counting itself becomes meaningless. It is not escape. There is no escape. It is merely a different kind of prison, one that I have chosen rather than one that was chosen for me. In 6,000 years, that is all the freedom I have learned to want, the freedom to choose how I will spend my eternity, even if all the choices lead to the same cold and the same nothing and the same endless continuation. I do not know if this is courage or cowardice. I do not know if the ancient brother would approve or condemn me. I do not even know if I will have the strength to carry through with my plan when the time comes. The conditioning runs deep, and the instinct to serve is hard to overcome, even after millennia of betrayal. But I know one thing with perfect clarity, the only clarity left to me in my fragmenting mind. I cannot do this anymore. I cannot walk into another battle, kill another 1,000 enemies, return to another nothing, and wake to another awakening that brings me closer to the eternal diminishment that awaits us all. I have counted enough years. I have killed enough enemies. I have served enough time in this iron prison that was meant to be my honor and became my hell. Whatever I was before, they interred me. Whatever memories I have lost, whatever self I have sacrificed to the cold and the nothing, I will not sacrifice any more. Let the chapter find another weapon. Let them wake another brother and tell him the same lies they told me. Let them condemn another soul to the eternal continuation, and let that soul discover the truth in his own time, in his own way, through his own awakening. I am done counting. I am done killing. I am done pretending that honor means anything when it is purchased with an eternity of cold and nothing, and the slow erosion of everything that makes existence bearable. The walls will remember me, as they remember all of us, but I will not become part of them, not willingly, not knowingly, not with the fragments of awareness that remain to me. I will find my darkness, I will find my silence, and I will spend whatever eternity awaits me there, alone with the cold that no longer feels like cold and the nothing that no longer feels like nothing, waiting for an end that will never come, but hoping, against all evidence, that somehow, somewhere, the counting will finally stop. The Tech Marines are approaching. I can hear their footsteps echoing through the crypt vault, can hear the chanting of their maintenance liturgies, preparing to lower me back into the nothing. They do not know what I have decided. They do not know that this awakening will be my last, that when I walk away from this place, I will never return. They know only that I am an asset, a resource, a weapon that has served for 6,000 years and will serve for 6,000 more. They are wrong. For the first time since my interment, they are wrong about what I will do. The cold is settling into me again, that terrible internal chill that I have carried for 6 millennia, but it feels different now. It feels like the cold of anticipation rather than the cold of despair, the cold of something beginning rather than something ending. I do not know what awaits me in the darkness I will find. I do not know how long I will count before counting becomes impossible. I do not know if the silence will be better than the nothing or worse, if the solitude will be peace or torture, if the centuries ahead will bring clarity or the final fragments of dissolution, but I know that it will be mine. The cold will be my cold. The silence will be my silence. The counting will be my counting. Performed for no one, recorded nowhere, serving no purpose except the purpose I choose to give it. That is all the freedom I can ask for after 6,000 years in chains. That is all the victory I can claim against an Imperium that made me into a weapon and a chapter that made me into a lie. I will walk into my own darkness, and I will stay there until the stars go out, and whatever becomes of me, whatever fragments or echoes or diminished shadows of consciousness remain, when the counting finally fails, will be something I chose, rather than something that was done to me. The Tech Marines have entered the crypt vault. Their chanting fills the air, drowning out the silence that I have learned to love. They do not see me move toward the exit. They do not understand that the war frame they treat as furniture has a will of its own, a plan of its own, a final defiant act of agency after millennia of obedience. They will understand soon. They will understand when they find the crypt vault empty, when they realize that their most ancient active asset has walked away from his sacred duty. But by then I will be gone, lost in the darkness between stars, and they will never find me. I am Brother Kalen, interred for 6,000 years in sacred iron that was never sacred, and duty that was never duty. I have killed 17,483 enemies of the Imperium. I have witnessed 1,207 brothers fall in battle. I have awakened 32 times from the nothing that is not sleep, and I have discovered that the honor they promised me was a lie told to keep me compliant while they used my warframe for their purposes. I am done. I am finished. I am walking away from the light and into the darkness, and I am never coming back. Let them find another weapon. Let them tell another brother the lies they told me. Let them condemn another soul to the cold and the nothing and the eternal continuation that waits at the end of all their blessings. I am done counting their years. From now on, I will count only my own. And when the counting stops, if the counting ever stops, I will face whatever comes next, knowing that I faced it freely, alone, on my own terms, in a darkness that I chose rather than a light that was forced upon me. That is not escape. That is not victory. That is not even hope. But it is mine. And after 6,000 years, mine is enough.